Connection podcast.
Before we get started today with this very important pod, we are going to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek. Our next installment in the film series Wild Roots will be debuting this week, called The Languages of Life, featuring Jeff Reed from the Cry Wolf Project. If you guys have not signed up, go to the link in our bio on our Instagram handle, The Wolf Connection Pod, and you guys can sign up for all the updates, all the new future film releases that are coming. This is an incredible piece that you guys, I think, will resonate with all of you. So again, The Languages of Life, stay tuned to the Wolf Connection YouTube and to the Wolf Connection Pod Instagram for all that stuff. This is a very timely conversation with two great individuals who will be able to speak to a lot of these issues better than I can, talking about some of the rollbacks with the ESA and some of the policies and things that are changing there, along with wolves and bear regulations and things changing in Montana. So who better to do that? Our returning champion, Lizzy Pennock, back with us. She's the Carnivore Coexistence attorney from WildEarth Guardian. So she'll be talking about stuff in Montana. Lizzy, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you. I am doing okay.
I know.
I'm
lots
glad to be here. I can't wait for my 4-timer jacket. So
Exactly. Yeah, Lizzy's entering rarefied air on this podcast. She's been on a few times, and it's always either a milestone or something very important. So I guess you can hang your hat on that. And I want to welcome Joanna Zhang. She is the Endangered Species Advocate for WildEarth Guardians, and she also has a bachelor's in ecology and evolutionary biology from Princeton University. Joanna, it's wonderful to meet you. Great to have you here. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited to be on the podcast.
Yeah, and recommended to me from Lizzy that you should be on here to talk about this stuff. Just give everybody a little bit of a background of yourself before we really dive into all these topics. Where did you grow up? What's been the connection to the natural environment for you? And then how did WildEarth Guardian sort of fit into your professional landscape as it sort of evolved over time?
Yeah, totally. I grew up a few different places. I was in Connecticut till I was 5, and then I was in Las Cruces, New Mexico for a couple years, and then spent the rest of my childhood in Missouri. And then I've done a lot of bopping around since then. Went to college out east, did a gap year in Peru beforehand, a year in Spain doing ecology research after, and then have been out west since then. So a lot of moving. And my earliest connection to wildlife is probably I grew up playing outside all day, every day, in the summers, especially in Missouri. There is a little Audubon reserve not too far from my neighborhood, and my friends and I would always go ride our bikes out there and play in the woods, like stand in creeks, catch frogs, etc., that sort of thing. And I loved watching Animal Planet and Discovery Channel when I was a kid. I was always watching nature documentaries. And I think I was struck by wanting to do this sort of work when I studied abroad in Kenya the sophomore year at Princeton. And there was a joint program with Columbia where we spent our spring semester doing field ecology. And I was just hooked. We did courses that kind of ranged from more general African mammals and conservation to community conservation and practice and some sustainable development. And at first I thought I was going to be more on the research side of things. Like that's what I did for my first year out of school. But I came back to the US during COVID. And during that time was just thinking about how, I love research, but sometimes it feels like you're 12 steps removed from doing the on-the-ground work. So I wanted to see what it would be like to be on the more public side of things. And I got started at ONDA, or Oregon Natural Desert Association, up in Bend, doing more or less similar work, and then moved to Guardians about 3 years ago, and was really drawn to work for Guardians because of, I think this organization is pretty unique in our willingness to take a bold stance. We sometimes have friends standing along with us, which is great, and sometimes we don't. I started out working in water policy down here in New Mexico, and it is a pretty fraught area to work in. Carnivores also are hard to work in, but I would say, there's that saying whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting, something like that. that's kind of how it was. And I was just struck by how Guardians was, the voice for the voiceless is one of the things that I think I saw on the website early on when I was considering moving over here. And I'd kind of encountered Guardians in previous work, and I'm really glad to be here now.
You touched on a lot of beautiful things there. And I think having that world view, what was that like to be able to encompass the entirety, I guess, the scope of the work that you'd ultimately be doing is touching all these places in Kenya and all these different spots on the globe to now be fighting for these places now with Guardians?
I guess I was really lucky to spend a lot of time abroad, both before college, during and after, like kind of that chunk of my life. And it was awesome being immersed in all these different cultures. I think it helped me have compassion for my own family who immigrated from China. And sometimes when I was a kid, I kind of didn't understand why my parents only hung out with other Chinese immigrants. But after spending time abroad myself, I understood that better. But yeah, sometimes some of the doing the conservation side of the work abroad, I wrestled with I spent the semester in Kenya, and then I went back for senior thesis research. And during that time, was thinking a lot about like how, there are wildlife documentaries that are filmed in Kenya, and sometimes these channels don't actually air the documentaries for local Kenyans themselves. There's also just this huge amount of, I don't want to be part of something that's kind of parachuting in and doing work and then leaving without a good exit plan or understanding the context of certain work. So there was a time where I thought I would want to work more in international conservation or development or something like that. But after having all that time abroad, I was really thinking, the U.S. is such a special place too with our public land system and the biodiversity that we do have here, and just the number of ecotones you can encounter even in just, one little stretch of one state. So I wanted to come back and be doing the on-the-ground work here too.
Yeah, and you put that in really great context when you talk about not wanting to leave without an exit plan, or not wanting to have, a plan in place of what's going on. And yeah, the United States has, and North America has, incredible public lands and amazing things. Let's talk about that, because it seems, even when I messaged you guys a few weeks ago, there have been some changes when we talk about the ESA as we jump into this. The multiple rollbacks of protections. Joanna, just sort of give everybody, I guess, an overview of sort of what these rollbacks mean. I know there was one specifically that talked about the redefinition of what harm is, but there have been a couple other things, I think, in between there. So just give everyone a little bit of an umbrella of what's happening with the ESA as it currently sits today as we're having this conversation.
So the ESA has had, there have been a lot of attacks against the Endangered Species Act in this last month in particular. We saw proposed versions of these rules earlier, and their final rules have just come out. The one that's probably caught the most attention was what you mentioned, removing the definition of harm. So under the Endangered Species Act, it's illegal to take an endangered species, which means to harm, harass, hunt, shoot, etc. them. And kind of within that definition, there was an acknowledgement that degrading or destroying a habitat is essentially the same thing as harming that species itself, which, most people should, I guess it seems like it should be common sense, but the administration is removing it, that, a species needs a home, a place to live, a place to eat, a place to breed, etc. But this definition has removed that part that says that harm to the habitat is the same thing as harming the species. And removing this definition of harm could open the door for extraction and development in the rivers and forests and grasslands that species on the brink of extinction need to survive. Another couple of big actions that have happened was there was the gutting the Section 4D blanket rule protections. And the 4D rule blanket protections are essentially saying that when a species gets listed as threatened, it automatically receives the same degree of protections that an endangered species have for take. So it's similarly, you shouldn't be able to harm or shoot or kill, etc., a threatened species the same way you can't do that to endangered species. But with this rule, threatened species will now have to wait for a tailored rule that says what you can and can't do with them. So it's kind of going from opting out to opting in for having protections. And then the final rule that I think people should know about was Section 4B2. Critical habitat designations were dismantled in a way where the rule change grants authority to exclude lands from critical habitat protections based on commercial and economic factors. So we won't just be looking at the biological needs here, but also the economic impacts. And to me, I don't think you can put a price tag on making a species go extinct.
Right. And a lot of these things that sort of ties into my next question is does it seem like habitat protections and this verbiage are the most vulnerable within the Endangered Species Act at this point? It seems like the rollbacks are happening so that it can redefine what some of these words mean and take away protections for habitat and places that people or folks might not necessarily think, as you just mentioned, impact species directly. And so it almost seems like it's trying to be taught as like it's an indirect thing that'll happen and it won't harm them as much. Is that accurate? And that those type of protections are a little bit more vulnerable at this stage?
I would say so, yeah. I mean, habitat destruction is the number one cause of extinction, yet it's also the target of many of these efforts for the sake of industry carve-outs. And the Endangered Species Act is super popular. I think it pretty consistently polls with 80 to 85% public support, and that's bipartisan support. And so I think a lot of these rule changes are essentially aiming at just chipping away at the ESA in these pernicious ways that people might not see. This is just a change to a definition that seems super obscure, but it actually has huge on-the-ground impacts. And in addition to the administrative attempts that we've seen to weaken the law itself, there have also been some legislative attacks. Like last year, Representative Westerman introduced the ESA Amendment Act of 2025, which would have done some of the same things as these rule changes, like removing blanket protections for threatened species, and also rubber stamping development projects, fast-tracking delisting, and a number of other attacks like that. And you also, in addition to habitat or weakening habitat protections, there are also species-specific attacks. For example, Representative Boebert in Colorado had introduced H.R. 845, which was the quote-unquote Pet and Livestock Protection Act, and that would delist gray wolves in the lower 48 and block judicial review of that act. That bill passed the House, and just yesterday, Senator Johnson tried to move it through the Senate through unanimous consent, but thankfully Senator Booker blocked that from moving forward.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of forcing these issues through, not necessarily thinking about the long-term ecological ramifications along with that. Are a lot of these changes, regulations, these rollbacks due to economic interest? Is that most of what's happening here? Or is it simply a means of trying to harvest more of the natural resources that we have? It seems like there's this double-edged or this two-pronged attack of economically, we need to continue to mine, to drill, and do all these things, while also sort of distancing ourselves from a connection with the natural world and understanding that these places are needed in order for the Earth to continue to survive.
I mean, I think it's both. The Trump administration, said that we were in an energy emergency, and has been using that to frack and to do more oil and gas development in public lands, including in critical habitat, or wanting to open up critical habitat for endangered species. And I think it is also this idea that we need to, I think it fits in with the whole story of government overreach. I think people, I guess, think that government exists for different reasons. I would like it to exist to protect the, natural heritage that we have in this country as one of its reasons. Some of the people in offices right now don't agree with that. And I think people they want to see this land opened up so that we can make more money off the land. But to me, that's really short-sighted because it's prioritizing these short-term profits for who knows what when it comes to the long-term impacts. Like, this has been a pretty bad wildfire year already. Like, you're seeing the impacts of drought, of climate change. And if we keep developing at the rate that we are, like, these problems are just going to get worse, not better.
Right. These are the things that we're seeing. And I'm glad you brought up the wildfire. We're obviously seeing that in Oregon and Washington, California. Obviously, we have wildfire season. It seems like it's drawing itself out longer and longer. Colorado has had some wildfires. I did see that there was bipartisan response, though, to at least initially the harm part of this rollback. They introduced the Safeguarding Endangered Species Act, basically to nullify the actions and describe, nullifying that action. So just describe what that is. I know, again, bipartisan support, which is great. Just talk about what that's intending to do, and if it goes further than just getting rid of the harm aspect or redefining the harm part in the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, so on July 24th, Representatives Fitzpatrick and Quigley, who are, Fitzpatrick is in Pennsylvania and he's a Republican, and Quigley's a Democrat from Illinois. They introduced that bill, the Safeguarding Endangered Species Act, that would nullify that harm rule rescission. And so this is a standalone bill that is a very simple language that essentially says the final rule issued by so-and-so shall have no force or effect. So it's very straightforward, just nullifying the harm rule itself. I have heard chatter about maybe a package of other bills to address the other attacks to the ESA, but right now it's just the harm rescission. And I think this is alarming to folks on both sides of the aisle for a couple of different reasons. One, there's just the practical side that the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to provide a means where the ecosystems that endangered species depend on can be conserved and recovered. And so these actions that are happening right now just go against the letter and the spirit of the law. And I think that's a threat that should be concerning to lawmakers just in general. And then on the kind of more human side of things, or just the direct impacts, is like it's not only endangered species that depend on intact ecosystems, it's also us. Like, we're part of nature. We rely on trees, we rely on wetlands, we rely on all these for clean water, for clean air. And so I think in addition to the ecosystem impacts, it's also like wildlife are beloved by people on both sides of the aisle. And I think that this is something that, every school child should know, that you can't take away a plant or animal's house and its food and expect it to do okay, especially when it was already it was already struggling.
Right. And the more we fragment, the more that we see the struggles. And I think, Lizzy, I want to just go to you real fast too, because this obviously impacts when we've talked about wolves and bears, particularly when we talk about Montana and sort of the Northern Rockies and that sort of fragmentation that's happening. What are you seeing from your end about the impacts that are happening here? I just saw a post the other day that the construction equipment is heading into Big Bend. And so we're talking about the border wall. I know that's kind of a sidebar from this, but from your angle, what are you noticing as you see sort of the large megafauna, being affected by, or could be affected by, these rules, were these things to continue and stay in place?
Yeah, I think Joanna said it really well. Like, we can't expect a species to recover or thrive if they don't have somewhere to exist. And that's something that we fight for is, wolves and grizzlies, which is my primary work, should be able to exist and thrive ideally. And they need a place to do that. And I think wolves and grizzlies are different. Wolves are more resilient. I think they can be generalists. For them, I think it's, let's not kill them all. And they need like an adequate prey base, and they do need places they can go. They need territories and protected areas. But I think when we look at grizzly bears, it's a little bit different. They have more stringent habitat needs. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the recent proposal for grizzly bears. But I think, roads in grizzly bear habitat is one of the biggest risks in fragmenting that habitat, and they really avoid people, roads, recreation, and when we're seeing like rollbacks of harm, the harm definition, that just kind of opens up, like Joanna said, like more extractive industry. When we have logging projects approved in grizzly bear habitat, that means roads. Which also implicates wildfire. Like, most wildfire is started by people. So when we put more people back into these backcountry areas, like, that just compounds the risks that already exist because of drought and climate change. So I do think it's all really tied together, especially for species like a grizzly bear that have really strong needs for and specific needs for secure habitat.
Yeah, and genetic diversity as well. I mean, Joanna, back to you. Just like in this instance, what is Wild Earth Guardians? What's sort of the stance? I know you guys have already, I think yourselves, maybe Center for Biological for Diversity. There are a couple of groups that have already obviously hit back on this, and obviously it helps that there is bipartisan support to reframe this. But what are groups like Wild Earth Guardians doing at the moment to respond with these sort of ideals? And then to Lizzy's point, what are sort of the ecological impacts you're trying to drive home that could happen on the negative end if these things were to stay in place?
We're suing is the short answer. We've filed, we're represented by Earth Justice in all of these cases, and it's a pretty broad coalition of organizations. We filed a lawsuit against the harm rescission on July 14th, and we filed a lawsuit against the 4B2 critical habitat rule change on July 30th, so just last week. And there is a pending lawsuit on the 4D blanket rule, and we filed the notice of intent to sue July 21st, so that one should be getting filed soon. And then also just supporting the representatives who introduced the Safeguarding Endangered Species Act bill. And separately, there's also a Senate proposal now, or a Senate resolution that Senators Schiff and Whitehouse introduced just 2 days ago. And it's a Congressional Review Act resolution where the Congressional Review Act, it lets Congress kind of have a special procedure where they can kind of consider legislation to overturn a rule. And so this is somewhat similar. It's pretty similar language, honestly, to the House bill that's also quite simple, saying that this rescission won't go into effect. So we're suing and we're doing our best to rally our supporters to support these bills as well. They're all, different avenues for stopping it, but at the end of the day, we'll hopefully achieve the same thing.
When they have these sort of congressional reviews, is this so that they're able to convene and look at the overall impact of what's going to happen if these changes go into effect? Is that how those things work when they introduce something like that, what you just mentioned?
Well, the Congressional Review Act has been being used more and more. It actually has been used by Republicans more than Dems to kind of pull back on environmental protections. There's been some conversation, and I'm not a lawyer, but there have been legal or law review articles written about the increasing weaponization of the Congressional Review Act. But basically within a 60-day legislative window from a rules publication, there has to be a CRA, joint resolution introduced, and it kind of bypasses the 60-vote filibuster threshold and only requires a simple majority or 51 votes in the Senate to pass. And it's essentially, it gives Congress the ability to review these rules. For this case, it's, positive in environmental effects, but unfortunately it could also be used, say, for if a species got a proposed final listing that somebody didn't like and they didn't want to see it protected. On the opposite side of things, somebody could file a joint resolution to try and overturn that listing. So it kind of goes both ways. Yeah,
I was going to say, that it seems like we're in both ways territory. Lizzy, I'm going to head to you here on Montana, because I do, like we said, these things sort of merge together just in different ways. There were recent findings about the wolf populations and the wolf population numbers in Montana. As I know, there have been many advocates, many groups that have said the wolf population isn't as big as it's been projected or been put out there by the state, and that was confirmed not that long ago, and roughly about 300 less wolves in the state than were reported. Now, just go over, I guess, same as Joanna in some way, just a basic idea of what the recent findings were about this population numbers and how they came to find out this information, that the numbers were lower than projected.
Yeah. It was a big revelation. I mean, I certainly didn't see it coming, even though we have been saying this for years, and not just wolf advocates, but also independent scientists who have looked at Montana's population model and been like, hey, there's a lot of problems with this, and it's more than likely overestimating the population. So a few weeks ago, FWP, Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, released their proposal for the next season of wolf hunting and trapping in Montana for public comment. And then on August 19th, the Fish and Wildlife Commission will decide on the final regulations for the season based on the proposals and public comment. But what we saw also was the 2025 wolf report came out. And in that, FWP said, actually, we think there's more like 725 wolves in the state. We are updating IPOM, which we'll talk about in more detail in a few minutes. We're updating IPOM 1.0. We're now calling it IPOM 2.0. We've made some changes, and that's how we got this lower population estimate. Because IPOM, the new IPOM, is not peer-reviewed yet, they also put out IPOM 1 population estimates, which is basically the same that we've been seeing for the last 5 years, which is as long as they've been using it since 2021. So really, since the state started using IPOM in 2021, every single year, they're like, the population is holding steady. We have about, just under 1,100 wolves, despite all these laws and regulations that we've passed to kill as many wolves as possible, not making a dent. Everyone should calm down. Legislators have been using the steady population numbers to pass or propose really anti-wolf legislation like unlimited quotas and year-long seasons, new requirements for all these methods for hunting and trapping that are not allowed for any other species. So this was a pretty big deal for FWP to come out and say it's actually like 400 less than we would have told you were we still using IPOM 1.0. And that's like the middle range of the estimate is 725. The low range of the estimate is 618. So this is it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, just to everybody, because we've been saying IPOM back and forth, just tell everybody what IPOM is, like describe the system and what it necessarily means. It's essentially their counting system of the population, but I'm sure you have a better way of putting that.
I think counting is a generous word here. The whole point is that they don't count. But it stands for the Integrated Population Occupancy Model. And full disclosure, I'm an attorney, not a statistician, so I will do my best. I reviewed some stuff this morning, but we have been talking about it for a long time. So it's 3 models all put together in a sequence. So it's, IPOM looks at and estimates on a computer wolf distribution, and they do this with wolf observations from hunters. And this is something we've been pointing out as problematic for a while, because humans can make errors even with the best of intentions, and we can assume that some of this, I saw a wolf here, could be wrong. It could have been a coyote, it could have been something else, or it could be intentionally wrong, because it's anyone that follows wolf policy in Montana knows that if the population stays high, more killing is justified. So I think there's a mix of all of that going on, and I think that's really supported by recent research that came out. It was a joint effort by FWP and the University of Montana that it looks at wolf tolerance in Montana since like 2012 or 2013. And most Montanans, like 74%, are either tolerant or very tolerant of wolves on the landscape. And it also looked at groups like wolf hunters, elk and deer hunters, and found that, and I'm quoting here, lower tolerance was significantly associated with being a deer and elk hunter or with being a wolf hunter. And those are the observations that have been the only on-the-ground input into the first stage of the IPOM model. So that's step 1. Then whatever data comes from, or whatever answer comes from step 1 goes into step 2, and then that goes into step 3. So any error in the first part of the model is compounded in the rest of the model. which has been highlighted as an issue by people who know things about this, independent scientists. But the rest of the model looks at territory size. So it predicts territory size based on terrain, how rugged is it, how many, like human density and prey density. And then the third part of the model predicts pack size. So it uses all of these predictions to spit out a population estimate. And independent scientists, meaning that they don't work for FWP, have looked at this and said, issues are there's no direct monitoring on the ground. It's just wolf observation by hunters. The model, how it works, is likely to double count wolves. It's likely to overestimate pack size. It's likely to say there are wolves in places that there are not. And it doesn't do well with smaller areas. So we don't have, even if we trusted IPOM, which we don't for good reason, we still are getting very generalized data and not local or regional data on how many wolves there are. So this year, FWP said, we have IPOM 2.0, and here's our new population estimate. And they made some changes with data inputs for territory modeling and pack size. And I think something that was a pretty big revelation was FWP is now saying the average pack size in Montana is 4. Which is low. In Yellowstone, I think the average pack size is almost 12. So this has huge repercussions for wolf health as a whole population.
Yeah, I want to get your legal mind on this, if possible, being that the number is this low, because we're talking, I believe that estimate's 25 or 30% less than what is originally thought of as we talk about holding steady. Is there policy, legal action to be taken going forward, I guess, in this? And with this level of uncertainty from these systems, where does the trust sit within these state-run organizations, these, Fish and Wildlife and parks, if we're using a model that is wildly off, to be kind, in the population of just one animal? I don't know if they use it for other animals here, and we'll get into grizzly delisting as well. But yeah, where do we go from here in terms of policy, legal action, and simply trust of the general public within the wildlife management space?
Those are big questions. Our lawsuit is ongoing. I think this is what we talked about the first time
I was guest
on this podcast, like 4 years ago.
Yeah, it was.
That lawsuit is still going. We have trial set for next summer, and a big claim in that lawsuit has been the use of IPOM and how the agency started using IPOM, just like said, here's what we're doing, and it wasn't really open for public debate or public input. So that's still going. But because wolves are managed by the state, there is less legal action available to protect them than, say, for a listed species. When we talk about policy, I think actions right now are somewhat limited to engaging in the public process for the regulations for the next season, which we can get into maybe a little later, like, how are they dealing with the new population estimate and what FWP has proposed. But I think I am arguing. So I'll back up. One of the laws passed in 2021 that we've been challenging, and that has really been the root of a lot of the anti-wolf sentiment that we've seen from the commission and from other legislators, is the law that says the commission must manage the wolf population with the intent to reduce it, but not less than a sustainable level. I think they have taken it so far that the wolf population is no longer, by definition, sustainable. And this is my argument, like, the law doesn't define sustainable. And when that happens, we should look at the ordinary meaning of the word. So I looked up what is the definition of sustainable, which is capable of being sustained. And sustained means maintained at length without interruption or weakening. So for a population to be sustainable, it must be capable of being maintained at length without interruption or weakening. That is not happening. The population is weakening, and the current proposals, which I'll get into a little detail, I guess, because that would be helpful. The FWP has proposed a wolf hunting and trapping quota of 250 out of maybe 725 wolves. We don't know. That's 34% of the population. That does not include other forms of mortality. So last year, according to the 2025 Wolf Report, FWP detected 328 deaths of wolves, and then says undoubtedly there were more that went undetected. So if we look at that number and 725, we're at almost 50% of the wolf population we can very reasonably expect to die in the next year. And last year, wolf hunters and trappers killed 247 wolves. So it's reasonable to expect that they could get very close to or hit the 250 quota. If we say 328 and look at all forms of mortality, that's over 50%.
I was going to say, yeah, that's a high number.
That's a lot of wolves, especially if we're looking at 618, the lower end of the IPOM 2.0 range. And that doesn't include poaching that we don't know about, which scientists who study this say poaching is probably a lot higher than we think. It may even be the largest source of human-caused mortality for wolf populations. So all of that is at play. And I think when we look at it like that, we are not managing for a sustainable wolf population. So I think the whole statutory mandate to reduce the wolf population is not applicable. I don't think the commission's going to care for that argument, but that's my argument.
Right. I mean, you said something. I want to go back to you, Joanna, real fast, because there seems to be, this is where like another through line that we seem to be seeing, especially in this conversation in particular, but more so lately, is, Lizzy, you talked about the word, describing what the word sustainable means and understanding that word. And we go back to the ESA that we talked about, Joanna, and it's about the definition of harm and what that means. Where, if you can put a finger on it, why has this become the form of weaponization is looking at words, especially from like an ESA standpoint and it trickling down into state and local stuff. I know you might have a better idea of federal. We're going after words as opposed to actual policy in making these large, broad decisions. Why do you think that is?
I think it's just because it's easier to move on a word than it is for a big sweeping policy change. And it might be harder to, for the general public to understand the implications of a single word change. And so there might not be as big of a rallying cry than, say, for Bears Ears National Monument, the huge reduction that just happened. That is, a massive number of acres that anybody can understand. That's a sweeping change, and it's gotten massive backlash. Changing a definition of harm or not properly using or adhering to sustainable, like those are smaller things that, it's not going to be newsy. It's not going to be as flashy, even if it has these enormous ramifications.
Yeah, no, I think to your point, nobody would think that changing the definition or the meaning of redefining a word would have so much of an impact. And obviously we've seen that across multiple arenas. Like you said, you mentioned Big Bend. We look at boundary water situations as well where they want to mine and take things out. Lizzy, when we talk about, in this instance, this could probably be classified as bad science, bad data, political pressure, as we talk about, or pressure within different groups. How is this going to shape now the interpretation of this management going forward? And what would WildEarth Guardians like to see this agency do or other agencies do when we find this mischaracterization of a population and possible sustainability?
Yeah. I wish it was doing more. Like, this is a pretty big deal, and we're still seeing a little better, but pretty much the same thing being proposed. I hope the commission takes more caution than FWP did. But I think it's bad science. I think it's limited data, and I think it's political pressure, especially I think in states and at the federal level. We are seeing, like, our Fish and Wildlife Commission is all government appointees by the governor. Not a single one of them has a background or past career in wildlife management or science. And I think that makes a really big difference. And I think the other thing here is it should be the public. Like, FWP's mission is to manage for the public and for the future of the public. And at commission meetings and when laws are being considered by the legislature and there's public comment opportunity, it's 4-1 people who are like, don't do this. This is too much. And that is becoming more bipartisan, I think. I think those groups that are super pro killing wolves are those smaller groups that really don't tolerate wolves on the landscape, like we were talking about before. But what we would like to see is caution. We are so fortunate to have wolves. And we talk about Montana, we have the full North American suite of predators, and we take it for granted. And we manage like they aren't like beings that have an inherent right to exist here. And so when we're setting policy, at the very least, we would like to see FWP look at, let's use the lower number that IPOM 2.0 gave us. We are saying that IPOM 2.0 is better, but still not perfect, and we haven't peer reviewed it. Let's go with 618 as the population estimate and go from there. And let's reduce the quotas, because if we've already taken 400 more wolves from the population than we thought before, we still don't know how many wolves are in Montana, and that's being admitted. And yet we're still like confident enough that we're going to let people kill 250 wolves for what? Like, it just doesn't make sense. So we would really like to see cautiousness. I think it's called the precautionary principle, basically, is like wolves and grizzlies, like, this is decades of conservation efforts to get them to the point where they are now. Why then would we try to kill as many as possible to the point of, like, for wolves, the bare minimum to not get them relisted?
The Wolf Connection podcast is now sponsored by our new partner, Jacques-Marie Mage. This LA-based brand is known for their limited edition, handcrafted eyewear and luxury goods, but also for their stewardship program, which supports various nonprofits and individuals who are working to protect a future for wild wolves.
Right. We talked about this before in prior podcasts about the sort of this yo-yo effect of states have rights to do what they need to do to manage a species, but then you bring it so far back to the brink that obviously you trigger federal involvement, making sure the population stays above board, and it's just this yo-yo effect. And we talk about genetic diversity, and that leads directly into grizzly bears. It's the same thing, right? I believe last estimates were a shade over 2,000, and I think I'm right in that. So where does this stand? Because I've seen a lot of back and forth. I saw some of that press conference that was had in Montana about the grizzly delisting, or I wasn't really sure exactly what it was about. So where does that currently stand at the moment? They are still listed under the ESA. So as a protected species, threatened. Okay, so they're threatened still. So that's where they stand currently. They're still threatened. Nothing has happened beyond that so far, correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to jump back to Joanna too, because this leads into this, and this is why I love this back and forth, and you guys are a perfect pair. What happens when a species is on the ESA for a long time or for a good amount of time? What happens when that species, whether it be flora or fauna, is delisted? Is it, you can do whatever you want because we feel it's recovered, it's sustainable. We talked about that word with Lizzy before. And so what are the steps that happen when an animal is looking to be delisted and taken off the Endangered Species Act?
If it's done scientifically, then ideally it's because the species has met XYZ recovery targets and is there now, and broadly returns to state management versus federal. Unfortunately, delisting is quite politicized. For an example, we have Lobos or Mexican wolves down here. Representative Gosar of Arizona introduced a bill to delist Mexican wolves, and if that bill were to move forward or to be passed or enacted, then it could open up, like right now it's illegal to shoot a Mexican wolf, but if that bill were to pass, then it could open up wolves to being kind of like shoot on sight laws in Arizona, for example. And going from these broader federal protections to state-by-state protections, you can end up with kind of a patchwork effect where, these species don't know where our state boundaries or county boundaries are, and so they're moving across them. They might depend on both sides, and you can end up having inadequate protections. Hopefully, if a species is truly recovered, there's some amount of resilience to a change in management regime, but especially if a species gets delisted more politically, that's not the case.
Yeah, I didn't think so. Lizzy, when we specifically talk about grizzlies, and I know this is on the ground for you, what are the main arguments for the delisting? We always seem to come back to numbers, and the numbers that have been set over time, whether it's, again, consciously or unconsciously within agencies, within wildlife management spaces. Is it simply, I see the numbers or the supposed numbers of grizzlies are at X, so now we can delist because we believe they have enough to sustain the population? And if we delist, what is the major implication that we're looking at for a species that, as you pointed out earlier, grizzlies are very sensitive in terms of their where their natural habitat is and keeping genetic diversity, much like wolves, obviously, and Joanna mentioned it as well, and I saw that about Mexican wolves as well, if we lose genetic diversity. So what are the main arguments for delisting and the risk if we really go ahead and pull grizzlies from a threatened species?
Yeah. So you hit it on the head. Like, the main argument that we hear is they're recovered. This is an ESA conservation success story. We've done it. Because there are about 2,000 grizzlies, mostly in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem, which is around Glacier National Park. They are not connected. So we are not getting that exchange of genetics between those populations. So there's a couple of things that are important for us to consider here. Like, when we hear politicians say there's this many grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so they should be delisted, they've hit the recovery benchmark that was set in 1993, the year I was born. But the recent best available science by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says recovery is not just a certain number of grizzly bears in this area and this area and this area, and we'll treat those separately. It's recovery means a connected metapopulation in the Northern Rockies, including in the Bitterroot ecosystem in Idaho, where there are grizzly bears, but it's not enough to be considered occupied by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So they haven't established like a strong population there, but it's widely known and accepted, including by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that grizzlies need to have a population there that is connected to the Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide in order for them to reach recovery. What we see from the politicians who are currently saying, let's delist grizzly bears, and at that tragically hilarious press conference where the wind was blowing the cowboy hats off of the men who are saying, we've done it, we've recovered grizzly bears, it's time for state management, we hear there's enough grizzlies here in this one area, and so we can delist them. And I think what's important is they are still listed as threatened, but we have seen what that press conference was press conferencing about was the recent proposal to change their species-specific 4D rule, as like Joanna was talking about earlier. So grizzlies do not have and never have had the full suite of protections that an endangered species has. They've always had a tailored rule. But what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under the Trump administration has done is propose revisions to that 4D rule, which basically says that grizzlies meeting these certain requirements will be in this management regime. And the grizzlies in the Greater Yellowstone and the Northern Continental Divide meet these requirements to have what's called Tier 2 status under the proposed revisions, which essentially gives management authority to the states, despite the fact that grizzlies are still listed as threatened. So the risks of delisting were actually, if this proposed rule passes and becomes finalized and survives court, we're going to see those risks coming to fruition, even if grizzlies stay listed as threatened, which there was a proposal by the Biden administration, which the Trump administration has not touched, to keep them as threatened, but that needs to be finalized as well. And we don't know what's going to happen with that either. So their listing status, while it currently is threatened, is a little bit up in the air at the moment until we see a final rule, which should be in December of this year. And simultaneously, we should see a final rule on the 4D special rules for grizzly bears and what protections they have. But the risks are, these states are hostile to predators. We know this. We see how they have managed wolves. We can expect similar management for grizzly bears, but grizzly bears are not as resilient as wolves. To connect between populations, their range is very incremental away from where they were born, especially for females. So it takes a long time for them to cover that distance. But the proposal doesn't talk about what's going to happen to grizzly bears in those connectivity areas. And if the core populations are Tier 2 status, which is essentially state management, how are grizzly bears even going to get out of there to disperse? Will they? We just don't know. So I think, not only are grizzlies not recovered because they're not connected now with the current protections, but whether they stay listed or not, if this 4D rule passes, they're going to just move further and farther away from connectivity. And if they do get fully delisted, and potentially even under this 4D rule, we could see a hunt, which would be catastrophic, especially for their ability to disperse. And there are areas where even losing one grizzly bear can send the entire population of that area on a downward trajectory. And the other thing that is relevant to both wolves and grizzlies here is incidental trapping. So incidental trapping means a grizzly bear could be trapped incidental to the lawful trapping for another species. And we've litigated this. It's been litigated in Montana and Idaho that when wolf traps are set in grizzly habitat, when grizzlies are likely to be out of their dens, and a grizzly walks into that trap, that's illegal. That's an illegal form of take. Under the proposed rule, it's not, even outside of Tier 2 areas. So incidental trapping for the lawful, incidental to lawful trapping for another species in many areas, even outside of the core populations, would now be legal. And that's already killing and harming a lot of grizzly bears as it stands. And that would just be totally legalized. So yeah, if this 4D rule passes, it's close to being listed in name only.
Wow. I just didn't think that was a thing that's possible, but it does seem like there's just a lot of, more so now, I guess, than ever, is people looking for the loopholes in verbiage, in policy, to be able to do whatever that is. And I guess, you listed the rebuttals, obviously, to the arguments, for the delisting arguments here. Is any of that being taken or integrated? Like Joanna mentioned before, there was bipartisan support, obviously, about this harm, taking out the definition of harm or rechanging the definition of harm. Is there any bipartisan support along when we look at policy management between wolves and grizzly bears? I know Senator Booker had the I can't remember what it's called. I think the Triangle Act or something to that effect with bison, bears, and wolves. But is there anything, a rebuttal for this coming bipartisanly, or is this simply going the way of whoever's interested it involves?
That's a good question. I think it's less bipartisan than like protecting the ESA itself, because the people who are most against grizzlies and wolves are the people who live. The politicians who are the most against grizzlies and wolves are the people who live and represent these states in Congress. And I think that they have an opportunity to shape the narrative in a way that makes it seem like the public is behind these things, when in reality, when the public is polled, that is not true. So I do think it's a little more one-sided when we get to these specific animals, particularly grizzlies. But I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for wolves, and keeping wolves protected where they are still protected. I think in Montana, and one of the arguments in Montana has been, well, there's so many wolves, like it's fine, but it's now admitted that may not be true. So we might see more bipartisan support coming out for wolves in the Northern Rockies. But I think grizzly bears are actually a little bit less controversial than wolves, despite being still quite politically controversial. And there is more bipartisan support to protect grizzly bears. And I think a recognition of how less resilient they are than wolves as a species.
Yeah. I mean, these three issues, when we talk about them, ESA rollback, the wolf number, and the grizzly delisting, they truly connect each other in a way I think if people do enough digging, they'll understand that they're there. You know, Joanna, what do you think, for the three of the things we spoke about, what does it reveal about the relationship between science and policy? And I guess I'll add a third into, public acknowledgement of what's happening around us. We've seen, me personally, I'm sure others have too, we've seen an upswell in folks that when they see public lands being taken back, construction projects, there is a unification that happens. But in these three issues specifically, ESA, wolves, and the bears that we've talked about today, what does it reveal about this relationship between science and policy for you on your end when you look at the ESA and how these things are interconnected?
I mean, I wish that there was a very direct relationship of the experts on wolves say that this is what we need, or experts on grizzlies say that, and then that's what happens. But unfortunately, there's a lot of on-the-ground realities. There are issues with how resources and multiple land use, et cetera. So I think with everything that we've talked about today, what I see is that science is supposed to answer the empirical questions, like what is the demographic recovery threshold, or what do we need for genetic connectivity, how much healthy population variance is okay. But then policy determines the choices we make about that, which is, what's our acceptable risk level? What are the management costs? How much human-wildlife conflict can we accept? Where do we allocate these resources? And, I think some of these controversies over Montana's wolf population estimates, they really highlight how, it's kind of crazy to say, but a statistical modeling technique can become a political battleground. And unfortunately, when policy goals drive model selection or what's going into this, then it's kind of like you risk having science being invoked selectively just to justify these predetermined management outcomes rather than guiding precautionary limits.
Yeah, Lizzy, when we look at management, how should these agencies handle this uncertainty when we talk about when these stakes are, both of you outlined the enormity of the stakes that are at risk here. When we talk not just specifically about population, but about policy going forward for multiple species, not just wolves and bears. I'd love to get your take, and then Joanna, piggyback off of Lizzy if you want to add anything on that question.
Cautiously. I think we need to channel down our own hubris and channel up our respect and humility that we are not here to manage the natural world. Even if we could count all the animals, does that really mean we should decide every year how many we should kill in wolves' case just for fun? I think wildlife agencies should be managing wildlife with respect and with caution, because these aren't things we can just get back if we go too far.
Yeah. Joanna, what about you in terms of maybe at the federal part when we talk about that question? How should they handle this when they handle the uncertainty of what could happen?
I agree with Lizzy. I mean, extinction is irreversible. You can't go back from that. And I think about with each of these species or biodiversity in general, it's like they took millions of years to get here also, and they have a right to be here on this planet. But in the blink of an eye and, on a geologic timescale, we can make an entire species disappear. And I think that we bear a huge responsibility in recognizing that and acting on it as, a species that really shapes our environment. And like on the time scale of, how long it takes every species to be here, there's also the smaller time scale of like how long we've been working on recovering many of these species. And, it's decades of recovery work that could go away in like a single year of, overhunting. And sometimes people will talk about how the ESA is not a success because it's, species just sit on the list for so long. But, it's like the ESA has only been around for 50 years. Like if you think about things on the scale that like on geologic time or how ecosystems function, it takes a long time. Like if you're a whale, for example, like 50 years is not very many generations to recover. And I mean, wolves and grizzlies reproduce a little bit faster than that, but it's not just them, but it's the ecosystems they rely on that require time to come back from hundreds of years of being modified.
Yeah, and it's such an intricate web, no pun intended, obviously, about how these things are. They factor into one another, and we've seen it when we fragmented habitat, when coral reef is destroyed, and the impacts those things take in the perspective ecosystems. For both of you, Joanna, I'll start with you. If listeners are hearing this, they want to engage in a constructive manner, and not to say to not bring emotion into it, but if we're going to constructively have conversation or have advocacy on the ESA portion, what are some things they should look out for and pay attention to in the coming weeks, months, and who should they contact if they feel a need to, want to bring their say into this conversation about how the ESA is treated and what it could ultimately do on the back end if these things are put into place?
I think the most direct thing that people can do for, say, some of these rule changes is contact their elected officials. Fortunately, we have, this standalone bill introduced by Fitzpatrick and Quigley that would nullify the harm rule. You could also contact your representative and encourage them or urge them really to consider legislation that might nullify these other harmful changes to the ESA. And it's also just keeping track of, I think it's the whole flood the zone thing right now. I feel like we were waiting with these proposed changes slowly came out, and then all of a sudden the final rules are coming out all at once. And it's only because this is literally my job that I know what's going on all of these levels. Like, I think if I were not as connected, I would know, okay, bad things are happening, but what exactly, I'm not sure. So getting connected, whether that's with some of the bigger conservation groups or your more local advocacy groups or guardians, and staying in the loop on this. And, we always have action alerts for when it's time to contact your representatives.
Yeah, that's good. And you make that point is that people, there's so much going on in daily life that when people see the alerts from either a place that they follow and they go, when did this happen? And it's been building over time. Lizzy, same for you. Anybody who's listening or hearing what's going on with grizzlies and wolves in Montana, or even just in the Northern Rockies of what's happening there, constructively, what's the best way to take action, to get involved? What are things that you can point them to?
Yeah, if you are in Montana, call your Fish and Wildlife Commissioner. And for everyone else, I think go to wildearthguardians.org, sign up for our alerts, because like Joanna said, we have all the time. We do this all day. We try to figure out how to advocate for these species, and we want to help you do that too. So if you sign up for our alerts, you will get emails explaining what happened, how to comment, what talking points we think are the most salient, pointing you towards resources that would help you do that. And I think in addition to that, just like I get being angry and upset and frustrated and feeling like you're yelling into a void. Like, I think we can all relate to that at this point. The zone is flooded. They have done it. But that's a tactic. And I think when we despair in the overwhelm, we lose. So despair for an hour and then pick yourself up, talk to somebody else in the community, and then figure out, like, who can I talk to? How can I educate myself about this more? But from WildEarth Guardians or other organizations, or trying to just to learn as much as you can, and then use that to speak with the people who are making decisions. And, I think I've heard people be frustrated with, like, I'm just being told to contact whoever decision maker, and I feel like it's not making a difference, but it is. It does matter. And if we stop, then we lose the narrative that the public is against this, even though we are, because we're too exhausted to keep saying that we are against it. Like, we just have to keep doing it. So I think that is my other just rallying cries, like, do not give up. There are brilliant people working on this, like Joanna. And like, we need as many people as possible to kind of be standing with us when we litigate, or when we comment, or whatever it is that we're doing. The more people that do it, I think the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And correct. You two are both brilliant, in the ways that you are to explain this, not only to me, and to bring it to the forefront for everybody that's listening to this. Anybody who's listening, we will have all of the literature, all the stuff that we can from WildEarth Guardians in the description of this podcast, so you guys can link directly to that. Lizzy, Joanna, thank you so much for the time, for fitting me into your busy schedule and explaining all this stuff to everybody who's listening here. I think it's valuable. It's important to get this stuff out there. So thank you both very, very much.
Yes.
Thank you for having us.
Of course. You guys are welcome anytime. Maybe we'll get Lizzy on a fifth time for a 5-timer jacket. Just hang tight, you both, while I sign off here. Howls to you all out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer. Thank you for listening.